Good morning.
In unison, good morning, Your Honor.
Wasn't there a witness?
Yes. Dr. Cantu, please.
You're still under oath. Please be seated.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes.
All right. Dr. Cantu, you have expressed an interest in countering the challenges that have recently come up to fingerprint identification. Is that correct?
I've been involved in discussions of that nature, yes.
And recent challenges have involved, for instance, a fairly well-known court case in Pennsylvania, where Judge Pollack ruled on fingerprint admissibility.
Yes, sir.
Okay. There have been some rather remarkable issues regarding reliability of fingerprint comparison, correct?
That's what I understand.
You're aware of the Oregon attorney who was accused of the Madrid terrorist bombing, is that correct?
I'm aware of that.
The people that did that fingerprint comparison were in the FBI office in Washington, D.C.?
That's correct.
Those are people you know, right?
No, I do not know them.
Okay, that's fine. In the context of this, you have expressed a desire to see that the second part of what we have been talking about. We've been talking about the first part, which is being able to see fingerprints so you can look at them, and then presumably compare them, right?
That's correct.
And the second part is comparing them?
That is correct.
And you have indicated that you believe there needs to be additional validation studies in order to bolster the admissibility of fingerprint evidence in this country, correct?
No, sir, that is not correct. I've been involved in discussions of that nature, but I don't think you've ever seen coming out of my mouth a statement like that.
Do you remember sending a communication to Richard Rao, RAU, who's the senior program manager at the National Institute of Justice?
He was.
And in February of 2000, did you tell him, it will not be long before more and more cases come up where fingerprint testimony will be challenged, and therefore we need to provide the examiners with necessary hard data on validation to counter challenges?
I believe I did say that.
Okay, alright, so when you're talking about validation, additional hard data on validation, you're talking about validating the second part, which is the aspects of comparison, that there's permanence, there's individuality, and that comparisons can actually be made to come up with a positive conclusion, right?
Well, that's what some people contend. I'm not, as I mentioned earlier, in that area. My particular expertise has been in the first part, coming up with technology for the visualization of fingerprints and advanced technology to be able to detect fingerprints that would not be able to be detected by the ordinary methods.
Okay, I understand. And that's a science. That's part of the science that you study. Is that correct?
Well, I'm a chemist.
You're a chemist. You're a scientist, right?
Yes, sir.
And you're a very senior scientist for the United States Secret Service, correct?
That is correct.
How many times have you testified in court?
Probably in excess of 40 times.
Okay, and how many times have you been called to testify in court before a jury?
About that many times.
About that many times. How many times have you been called by the prosecution, U.S. attorney, or the district attorney, or whatever the prosecution?
Most of those times.
Would it be all of those times?
I'd have to look at my records. I don't have that. I believe it's most of those times.
Alright, you're pretty sure it's most of those times, right?
Yes.
Alright, so you're trying to think, was there a time or two that you may have been called by a defense lawyer?
Yes, that's what I think.
Can't think of one right at the moment?
No.
Okay, and basically what you've come to tell us is that there's an ninhydrin process which makes it possible to visualize or see latent prints, that is, prints that you can't really see on paper. You use this ninhydrin, and they turn purple and you can see them, right?
That's one of the processes.
And that's been around since the 50s, right?
That particular one has.
And you developed actually a newer version of that ninhydrin process, haven't you?
Several.
Do you know what version of the process was used here in Santa Barbara, Santa Maria, with regard to Mr. Jackson's case?
Well, as far as the amino acid visualization, it was ninhydrin.
So you're aware of that?
Yes.
Alright, and then you've come to tell us that the superglue fuming process is one that's existed, I think you said, since the 80s. Is that correct?
I believe 70s, but
70s or 80s?
It's been quite some time.
Quite some time. And that's been around. And that basically is another way of visualizing these things, so you can actually see the ridge marks, right?
Depends on the surface, of course. But yes, in this particular case that's what was used.
And you've been told that. Is that correct?
Yes, I saw the evidence.
Okay, now, I think you said yesterday that you had not evaluated any of the evidence in this case?
No, I mean, I did say I had not evaluated any of the evidence.
Alright.
As far as the comparison of fingerprints.
So what you did is you looked to see what technology they used to bring forth the fingerprints so they were visual.
Correct.
Okay, and then you talked about the scenescope, which is a device that uses the ultraviolet light to make it easier to see fingerprints. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Alright, now, there are a couple issues that you're aware of. Let me see if this is true or not. Let's talk about a couple. 1. With regard to the fuming technique, the fuming technique can be done to excess. Is that correct? If you overfume the paper, you can lose some of the detail. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And when you have a scenescope, you can, in fact, minimize the fuming, because the scenescope is going to be more sensitive in picking up the ridges or the imprints of the ridges. Is that correct?
There's some truth to that, yes.
Okay, you also, well, let me ask this. Generally the scenescope company, the company, whatever its name was over a period of time that has manufactured this scenescope, recommends that film be used rather than digital when taking the pictures through the scenescope. Is that correct?
That's a recommendation, sir.
Okay, and you're aware that using a digital camera can actually filter out some of the detail. Is that correct?
No, that's not quite correct. It all depends on the digital camera, its resolution, and that's something that has to be taken into account. And the people at Specs are fully aware that a good digital camera will bring out the details that are in a fingerprint.
Their recommendation, however, is that you use a 35mm film camera, correct?
Like you said, a recommendation.
Alright, and you're aware of studies showing that some of the detail, particularly in between ridges or non-ridge detail of fingerprints, can be lost when using a digital camera, correct?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Alright, now, you told us that you developed prints. I mean, not oversimplify. You told us that you're familiar with the technology used to develop prints and, in fact, you participated in improving that technology, right?
Yes.
Okay, nevertheless, when you are dedicating part of your career to this, you must understand what it is that's going to be done with the developed prints, correct?
Right.
Alright, so you know that one of the things you're looking for, or a latent print examiner, which you're not, I understand. But one of the things that a latent print examiner is going to be looking for are ridge details. Is that correct?
Correct.
So when you talk about ridge details, you're talking about the parts of the skin that protrude and form ridges.
Correct.
Alright, the people who are doing this examination have begun to call themselves ridgeologists. Is that correct?
Yes, I've heard that term.
Okay, now, I'd asked you before, when it goes from your part of the science to raising the prints so they can be seen to the next step, the next step is not scientific, is it?
I wouldn't say that.
It's subjective, is it not, sir?
I cannot say that.
You cannot say whether it's subjective or not subjective.
It's not my area of expertise.
Okay, but basically, you have people who are going to look at what has been raised as a part of your technology, let us say, and they're going to compare it with a rolled print. You know that, right?
Yes.
And they are going to come to a conclusion as to whether or not they believe it matches, correct?
That is correct.
Alright, now, in the course of doing this, they'll be looking for the identification of certain points from the latent fingerprint to the known fingerprint. Is that correct?
That's the way the comparison is done, yes.
Okay, they'll also, besides looking for comparisons of ridge detail, they may also be looking for pores. Is that correct?
If they are present.
Alright, so that's one of the things that you would like to bring out with your technology? In other words, your effort to come up with the best latent print that can be obtained. You would like to have all the detail there that would be possible for a print examiner to compare, correct?
That would be ideal, but it doesn't happen all the time.
Okay, well, we'll get to what happens, but your goal is to give them the best print so that you can compare it?
Well, I should add, Even a rolled print that you've been talking about, one that's carefully done, sometimes does not contain any pores.
Alright, we're going back to pores, but that's where I was going back, so you're right. Okay, sometimes a rolled print doesn't even contain all the ridges, is that correct? There can be a fold in the paper, there can be some glitch in rolling the print?
That's correct.
Alright, now, digital imaging tends not to pick up the pores as well as film imaging or a film camera, correct?
I cannot say that, first of all, for reasons that it's not part of my expertise.
Now, let me just ask you about. I know I'm going to mispronounce it, but it looks like 1, 2 indane dione, known as IND, which would be my preference, if we can call it that. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
And is that an advancement in the visualization or the ability to visualize latent prints?
The amino acid portion, yes.
Do you know if that was used at all in this case?
No, it was not used.
And that's something that you helped develop here in the last 10 years or so. Is that correct?
Correct.
Alright, now, let's just talk briefly about prints in the demonstration that was given here. You recall the demonstration that was given yesterday?
Yes.
And you sort of stood back and you let Mr. Sutcliffe do it, I think. Is that safe to say?
That's correct.
You didn't have anything to do with putting the fingerprints on the paper that was put under the scenescope, did you?
No, I had nothing to do with it.
Okay, so, you would agree that when fingerprints are found in their natural state, for lack of a better term, but at a crime scene or wherever, you don't have, for the most part, you don't have people rolling their thumbprint on a piece of paper, correct?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Well, it's just a basic question. In other words, when we saw the demonstration, I believe that Mr. Sutcliffe at one point took his, it may have been his thumb or his finger, and he kind of rolled it, pushed it onto the paper so it could be seen. That's pretty much an ideal fingerprint, is it not?
Yes.
And, in fact, I think he was wearing gloves before he did that. He took the gloves off and made a good, clean print, is that right?
That's correct.
And you had a chance to see it up on the screen, correct?
I did.
And it looked like a pretty good, clean print, right?
That's correct.
And were you to see that in the actual course of a case, you would say that is a pretty good, clean print, right?
That's correct.
What happens is you have generally partial prints that are sometimes smudged, that are sometimes just the tip of a finger or the side, or the, whatever, correct?
Correct.
And so you try to develop whatever is on the paper so that it can be seen.
Correct.
Sometimes that fingerprint may be over another fingerprint or over some other imperfection in the paper, or whatever the substance is, that makes it impossible to see the rest of the print, correct?
It may.
So the challenge is to take whatever you have, and get as clear a picture of whatever that is so the latent print examiner can make a comparison. Is that right?
Well, my role is to provide them with the best possible tools to develop the print.
Right. And actually, you don't go out in the field and do this latent print development yourself, do you?
Not recently.
Okay. You've done it on occasion?
Yes.
Alright. Your job is really, as a chemist, for the United States Secret Service to come up with the best technology you can to make this work. Is that right?
That is correct.
And by this, I mean the visualization of these latent prints.
That is correct.
And this has been something you've been working on now for the last few years, is that right?
I think I mentioned in excess of 20 years. That's one of the areas that I get involved in. There are other ones, of course.
Originally you were with the ATF.
That's correct.
Alcohol, tobacco and firearms, right? And you've written a lot of papers, is that correct?
Correct.
You have written more papers, for instance, on the subject of identifying ink or pencil lead, those kind of markings on paper, than you have about fingerprint development. Is that correct?
I gave a number of, when I was asked about publications, and I think I said of 26 papers that are, published in peer-reviewed journals, and 9 of those are on fingerprints. And I've got 2 that are in review right now. One is a chapter in a book. And the other one is a publication on, again, on fingerprints, that's going to be in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. So that would be like a total of 11.
I thought you said 7 and 2 for 9, yesterday?
7 and 2, okay.
Alright, well, Whichever one it is, that's a lot of papers. But you've written more papers on ink and documents, the identification of ink and pencil lead and that sort of thing in document review than you have on fingerprints, right?
That is a fascinating area. Yes, I have worked on the area of the analysis of items on documents to be able to associate documents, date documents, and this includes ink, paper, pencil, erasure residue, and things like that. And fingerprints is just one of the items that you find on documents as well.
Okay, thank you. But the subject matter of the papers on ink had nothing to do with fingerprints, did they?
No.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Very briefly, Your Honor. As far as the use of digital cameras in capturing a fingerprint on a piece of paper, have you ever used a digital camera to do that?
We have tested some digital cameras for doing that.
And have you found them to be satisfactory?
I'm going to object as lack of foundation.
Sustained.
You said you've used digital cameras to, well, let me back up. Have you used digital cameras to photograph fingerprints in the past?
Our laboratory has.
And have you reviewed those photographs?
No, I have not had a chance to review them.
All right. As far as the questions regarding the protocol that was used in this case, have you had an opportunity to talk to Detective Tim Sutcliffe about the exact protocol that was used to examine fingerprints in this case?
Yes, I did.
And are you aware of the fact that they initially looked at the magazines to see if they could see anything with the naked eye or with a loupe?
I'm going to object that calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
Then I'll ask it in hypothetical form. Assume that, and this is a hypothetical. Assume that a large number of magazines are being looked at for latent fingerprints. Assume that the first step is to use an alternative light source. Look at the magazines visually. See if you can find any biological evidence, including fingerprints, on those magazines. Assume the next step is that you then fume the magazines with the superglue. And then you again look at the magazines using the scenescope and the alternative light source that's provided by the scenescope. You identify notable prints, you circle them, you have a system by which you identify those prints, and then you take it a step further. You use a ninhydrin solution and go on to a second phase of looking for prints on these magazines or I should say a third phase, where you're actually looking for identifiable prints that are shown by the ninhydrin solution. And you note those items, circle them, and document their location on the individual pages. In your opinion, do you have an opinion as to the validity or integrity of such a protocol for identifying and locating fingerprints on smooth magazine paper surfaces?
I'm going to object that that's an improper hypothetical, and it's vague as to the validity or integrity.
Overruled. You may answer.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You may answer.
I gave an answer yesterday to that effect when you asked me about smooth paper, like on a magazine, and I indicated a protocol that could be used. And I indicated that one would use optical methods first, maybe use the ultraviolet imaging source for the purpose of seeing if there's any prints that it could bring out before any processing. And then the super glue would be the next step, and see if there's any prints visually also using the reflected ultraviolet imaging system. And you find some. Let's say you find some in that case, and you mark them. And then the next step, let's go after the amino acids, and that would be the use of a ninhydrin or other reagents. But in this case, ninhydrin is the one that was used. So I did indicate that yesterday.
And so what is your opinion about the use of that type of protocol as far as its validity in locating fingerprints on smooth magazine paper?
I'm going to object. Asked and answered.
Overruled. You may answer.
No, I indicated that that's what would normally be done.
Is that the protocol that you yourself would use to find fingerprints on such an item?
Yes, we have used that protocol.
I'm going to move to strike. That calls for speculation.
Overruled.
You may answer.
Very well. We had a similar case in our laboratory where exactly the same protocol was followed.
I'm going to move to strike as non-responsive.
Sustained. Stricken.
I'll just ask you to answer this question. Just to satisfy the rules. To answer the question in a yes or no fashion. Isn't this the type of protocol you yourself would use if you were trying to locate fingerprints on smooth magazine papers?
Yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
Okay, now, You said you have done this a few times in actual cases, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. For the most part, somebody else does this in actual cases. Does this, bringing the fingerprints up either through alternative light source, fluorescence, ultraviolet, super glue, ninhydrin, or one of the other means. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. They do it, but I consult with them, and they consult with me, occasionally on the technology that they're using.
Okay, that's fine. And I didn't mean that to be a demeaning sounding question. I'm just saying as a practical matter, you're not the one out there putting on the rubber gloves and doing this in real cases?
Well, I have done that, too.
You have. For the most part, not, correct?
Correct.
There you go. Alright. Now, nevertheless, you are aware that fingerprints are the type of evidence that you want to preserve at a crime scene, is that correct?
Right.
Okay. And when I say, a crime scene, you understand law enforcement. Whatever type of law enforcement, Secret Service, FBI, the Santa Maria Police Department, Sheriff's Department here in Santa Barbara, whatever, they go to a scene where they think they may be recovering something that's going to have evidentiary value, right?
Correct.
And if there's any issue with regard to who may have touched something, you would think, based on your professional experience, that you would want to preserve that very carefully so that if there are any fingerprints there, they will be intact so that they can be made visible and then evaluated by a latent fingerprint examiner, correct?
Correct.
Alright, so you would not recommend, for instance, that somebody sees an item and not note for forensics that it should be preserved for fingerprints, right? Is that clear? It was kind of a negative. Let me rephrase it.
I'm going to object as vague.
Let me rephrase that.
Object as vague and beyond the scope.
First of all, I'm withdrawing it. So I can rephrase it, if I may.
Go ahead.
You talked about the protocol here. You just, in response to Mr. Auchincloss's question. Part of the protocol is to preserve the evidence, right? So you can visualize, you can make visible the prints that are there, right?
Right.
And you would expect that law enforcement, when they are seizing something that may have fingerprints, and fingerprints where identity may an issue in the case, for whatever it's worth, you would expect them to note for the purpose of forensics that this item is being preserved for fingerprints, correct?
I would expect that, yes.
And then you would expect that that item would be carefully handled until fingerprints are taken, correct? When I say, taken, fingerprints are developed.
Well, you are speaking about an area that we call collection and preservation of evidence. It's like a first part before we enter the part of the development and the part of comparison. There's actually another part if you do comparison with a computer with a set of database. But in any event,
let's stop there, because that's like the AFIS system?
Yes.
That's at the very end?
That's right.
And I just want to focus so we don't lose the jury here. We're at the very beginning?
The very beginning, the preservation and collection of evidence. And I get involved in the second phase. Now, I know some of the rules and regulations about conservation, preservation of evidence, and that is, first of all, don't put your prints on there. Wear gloves. And put it in a plastic bag. And all depends on the evidence as well. Some people, well, again, I'll just leave it at that. There's some rules and regulations about how to do this, and people that do crime scene investigations are trained to be able to do this.
Alright.
You always see them wearing gloves or wearing a handkerchief and picking things up so that they minimize the amount of handling. That's the object.
Because when you get involved as a scientist, you're part, and we understand sometimes you've done it, other times you've supervised, and other times you've studied it. But your part is the visualization of these prints, the science of trying to make the prints more visible, okay? But you are aware of the issue of contamination of evidence, correct?
Yes.
And that's something that comes up not only in fingerprints, but comes up with documents, and with fiber comparisons, and all sorts of things. Is that right?
That's correct.
So that, it's very important that evidence be preserved as it is found, as best as possible, so that the scientists and the examiner can do their job, correct?
That is correct. That's also part of the chain of custody. That's why we establish things like that, to avoid things of that nature.
When you say, chain of custody, we introduced a term here that hasn't been fully explained yet, so I'm going to ask you to do it. When you say, chain of custody, each person who touches the item, or takes the item somewhere, should clearly record what they're doing and make sure that they do not contribute in any way to contamination of that item. is that correct?
That's part of the regulations of chain of custody.
Alright, so at the very end, when somebody comes into court and wants to say to the court, and to the jury, and counsel, and the department, and everybody, here's this piece of evidence, they can say, well, I took it out of the evidence locker today, here it is, and prior to that, I booked it into the evidence locker, or we can bring in a series of people saying, they were booked in by me, it was taken out by the next witness, it was put back in, so on, correct?
I'm going to object as beyond the scope.
Sustained.
Okay. When you're talking about the protocol here, the issue of evidence collection and preservation is something that you're assuming or hoping would be done properly before you would get involved in the case, right?
That's correct.
Alright, now, with regard to fingerprints in particular, are you aware of, let me withdraw that. Are you aware of an alternative light source process to look at something to determine whether or not there are bodily fluid stains?
I'm aware of that, yes.
Okay, I'm not going to ask you to go into that in detail, but tell me. Can you tell me how that works in general?
Yes. An alternate light source came into existence after the laser-induced fluorescence was introduced, and that probably goes back to the 70s. But some people said, I can get the same effect by using a powerful light and just filtering it at a particular color that I want using a device that selectively picks out the frequency that you want. So the alternate light source is alternate to the laser, basically. And the lights range normally from the blue region all the way to the red region. And depending on which one that you have, some of them are very selective, like several wavelengths at a time, and a very narrow band. That's terminology used in optics. But in any event, very precise colors is what I'm trying to say. And what happens with this thing is you illuminate something, and it is possible that that material may have something that glows. You mentioned body fluids. Some of them actually have fluorescence that use goggles that block the illuminating light and you see any of the fluorescence that comes out.
Alright, so what color light might you have and what color of goggles, just so we have a picture?
I mentioned yesterday that in fingerprints, they usually have one that would be a blue-green light and they use orange goggles.
Just so we have a mental picture, without going into a lot of detail, because I'm sure we'll have more of this later. Somebody's got these goggles on that filters the light to a particular wavelength, or filters out other light, however you want to look at it, and they're looking with a light and they're able to see some things you couldn't see if you took the goggles out and just turned the house lights on, correct?
That's correct.
And is that destructive? Let's assume we're looking at magazines. Is that destructive of the magazine, do you?
Normally not.
Okay, so you do not consume the magazine, you don't interfere with subsequent tests like fingerprint tests, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and that type of a test can be done quickly, in a matter of minutes, or an hour, or a couple of hours, right?
Yes.
Alright, so it's not something that takes weeks or months to do.
Correct.
Alright, now, in a case where there is. The case is considered to be an important case, let us say. I suppose all cases are important to the people involved. You would expect that fingerprint evaluation would take place sooner rather than later, right?
Right.
You certainly wouldn't want to take, for instance, a container with all the materials, and take it to a grand jury and book it into evidence and then take it out months later and do fingerprints, would you?
Well, let me make a point here, if I may.
Before you make the point, is that what you would prefer to do, or not?
Not necessarily.
Okay, you would prefer to do the fingerprint evaluation first, before you go book something into evidence before a body, whether it's a grand jury, a trial court, or anything else, right?
Yeah, you would expect to do the analysis first.
Okay, and were you aware that the fingerprint analysis in this case wasn't done for over a year after the items were seized?
Objection. Argumentative. Beyond the scope.
Overruled.
Very well. First of all,
were you aware of that, was the question, sir.
I was not aware that they were a year old.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Dr. Cantu. Assuming that an item of evidence is properly handled with gloves. And let's narrow our hypothetical to magazines, all right?
Yes.
Bagged in paper or plastic at the scene, and preserved in that fashion for a period of 8 to 12 months. Would you expect the fingerprints that might be located on that magazine to disappear during that 8 to 12 months?
Your Honor, I'm going to object that is an improper hypothetical and misstates the facts in evidence. misstates any facts that may be shown in this case.
That.
Overruled. You may answer.
Fingerprints. I would not expect it to go away. We have had cases. Perhaps you have heard of a fingerprint that's, a 50-year-old fingerprint. The FBI used to talk about this quite a bit.
I'm going to move to strike as non-responsive.
That's fine. That's fine. I'll
Strike the second sentence.
All right. Dr. Cantu, why do you say that?
Which of the statements?
You just said you would not expect the fingerprints to disappear over that period of time, and now I'm asking you to elaborate. Why do you say that?
By experience.
Okay.
We have studied how long fingerprints last for the ninhydrin process or the amino acid process, and for the physical develop process, which I haven't gone into, but let's say the lipid portion of the wax and oils of the fingerprint, and they last a significant amount of time and can be picked up by the chemical methods that we have mentioned.
All right. And as far as contamination goes, is it fair to say that if a fingerprint is, well, let me strike that. Assume you're looking for an individual's fingerprint, a particular individual, individual X we'll call him. Is contamination, any form of contamination, going to affect whether or not that fingerprint changes to look like someone else's fingerprint?
I'm going to object. The witness. It's beyond the scope of his professed expertise to do comparison.
This is not a comparison question. The question is chemical. Chemically, based upon.
Excuse me, Your Honor, there's an objection pending.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
I'm sorry?
I am sustaining the objection.
Okay. Can a fingerprint of one person morph into that of another person with the passage of time or contamination?
Objection. Your Honor, it's beyond the scope of his expertise.
He has stated that contamination is not within his area of expertise, counsel.
Is there any chemical process, irrespective of contamination, any physical process that you are aware of that will cause a fingerprint of one person to change and turn into that of another's?
Objection. Comparison is outside his scope.
I'm asking him a chemical question. That is his area of expertise, the chemical formation of fingerprints.
I object to speaking.
Sustained. The question will be allowed. You may answer. Do you want it read back? Would you like the question read back? You may answer it.
Okay, sir, chemically, I could only say that the chemicals of the fingerprint residue can possibly change. But as far as the pattern, I don't think so.
All right, thank you.
I'm going to move to strike the last part, which he said he doesn't do comparisons.
I'm talking, well.
The objection is overruled. Motion to strike is denied.
Thank you.
Without belaboring this too much farther, there is such a thing as degradation of evidence, correct?
Yes.
And degradation basically means that over a passage of time, with or without other factors, evidence can degrade so that the ability to analyze that evidence becomes more difficult. Is that correct?
Not necessarily.
Excuse me. I didn't ask necessarily, so let me ask the question again so it's clear. Degradation involves something deteriorating over time, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and you're familiar with that in all sorts of areas of evidence besides, other than, let's say, fingerprints, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and degradation can take place because the underlying material on which the evidence is deposited starts to degrade, correct?
Correct.
Degradation can take place because there is, in fact, a chemical change in, we're talking about fingerprints, the actual fingerprints that are left on the item, correct?
Correct.
And just based on degradation, you can end up with a less clear latent print than you might have had, say, a year before. Is that correct?
Again, I'd say not necessarily.
I didn't ask necessarily. I said, you can.
Objection. He's answered the question.
I would like to.
Just a moment. Overruled.
I'm asking, is that something that's reasonably possible, that over a period of time, there can be degradation of a fingerprint, a latent fingerprint?
It is.
Objection. Asked and answered.
Overruled. Answer.
It is possible.
Okay, now, in addition to that, or let me stop on that for a moment. Part of what might happen over a period of time is that you lose some part of a detail in a print that might have been recoverable earlier, is that correct?
That may happen.
Alright, now, in addition to that, there's contamination besides just degradation of underlying materials and chemicals. There's the possibility of contamination, correct?
Objection. Beyond this witness's expertise.
Sustained. Sustained. That's the same objection you made earlier.
It was, but I thought it was overruled. I thought it was overruled on the contamination issue. Maybe I'm wrong. In any event, one of the things that you don't want to. So we're not being too mystical here with the use of the language. One of the things that you, as a scientist, if the question posed to you is whose fingerprints were on this magazine on November 18, 2003, you would, and you have, and you know that there's certain people who are, not by you, but eventually are going to be looked at as possible donors for the fingerprint. You would want to know that that person didn't handle the items in between November 18, 2003, and November 2004, correct?
Objection. Ambiguous.
It's not ambiguous, but it is so long.
That was my last question, too.
Would you ask?
I'll break it down.
Just ask the question.
Okay. Understanding for the moment that the task before long.
Wait. Just ask him.
Okay.
The question was. To get right to the question.
Yeah.
Let me stop this thing. And you know that there's certain people who are. Not by you. But eventually are going to be looked at for possible donors for the fingerprint. You would want to know. Here's the question. Do you want to know that that person didn't handle the items between November 18, 2003, and November of 2004? That's the question, without the.
From the point of view of developing fingerprints, I don't think it matters to me. I just process the fingerprints.
You talked about the protocol. And the protocol you told us included all of these steps from the beginning of collection of preservation onto the point of comparison, and you're involved in the middle. You said the protocol in this case looked okay, from what you saw, right?
Yes.
Okay, and my question is, you would want to know that one of the subjects did not handle the item in between the time it was seized and the time you're searching for prints, right?
You would hope so.
There you go. Thank you. No further questions.
No further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You may step down.
Thank you.
Call your next witness.
Lisa Hemman, Your Honor.
Come to the front of the courtroom, please. When you get to the witness stand, please remain standing. Face the clerk here and raise your right hand.
Yes.
Please be seated. State and spell your name for the record.
Lisa Susan Root Hemman. Lisa, Susan. Roote. Hemman.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you employed, ma'am?
I work for the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department.
And what's your current assignment?
I'm a senior identification technician in the forensic unit.
How long have you been with the sheriff's office?
8 years.
How long have you been an identification technician?
8 years.
Are you currently working a full assignment with the sheriff's office?
No, right now I'm on maternity leave.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Were you involved in handling any of the evidence from the Michael Jackson case?
Yes.
When did you begin your maternity leave?
December 17th, I believe, was my last day.
Of 04?
Of 04.
And what period of time do you recall having any contact with any of the evidence from the Michael Jackson case?
I was at the initial search at the Neverland Ranch in November of 2003.
And what were your duties then?
I was assigned to search the arcade, cellar building, and then the office that was part of the security building.
Okay. Did you seize any evidence yourself?
No, my assignment during that time was to photograph any evidence seized.
Okay. When was the next time you had contact with the evidence from that particular search?
January 2004.
Do you recall the circumstances around that?
Yes, I was asked to examine numerous items, do a cursory search for possible trace evidence and body fluids.
Do you recall which items of evidence you were asked to search?
Yes. Can I just pull them off my report so I get them down correctly?
Will it refresh your recollection?
Yes.
Please do.
I was asked to examine item 316, 317, 321, 363, and 364.
Could you describe for us briefly what you did with those items, the protocol you used?
I got each item independently, opened up the evidence bag, examined them under white light. They were books and magazines, basically. And then I searched them through ultraviolet light, looking for trace evidence, dried body fluids, or anything that fluoresced that seemed interesting that wasn't there when the book was, or the magazine was originally published. And I separated those items and sent them off to the Department of Justice for further testing.
When you handled 316, 317, 321, 363 and 364, did you come across, within those evidence bags, multiple items?
Yes.
And in the circumstance of a multiple item bag, what did you do, if anything?
When I came across an evidence bag that had multiple pieces of paper, magazines, or books, what I did with them, as I took them out of the bag, I put a small letter with an item number on the back of them, starting with A. So I put, say, 317, 317A for the first piece of paper. The next piece of paper I came across, 317B, and would go through the alphabet. And once I completed the alphabet, then I would start with A, and so on, and work through. So each individual piece, it could be a magazine intact, or a clipping, anything that was individual, got a letter put on the backside of it.
How did you handle the magazines or loose papers within those items?
I wore gloves, not to transfer anything of mine onto. I placed each piece of evidence down on a clean piece of butcher paper, and then I examined them with a light source.
Did you at any time photodocument the items within them?
Yes. When I originally took them out of the bag, before I did the examination, I took a photograph of it with a little post-it note saying this is item 317A, and then I'd take the next picture when I examined the next piece of evidence.
Okay. I have a number of exhibits here for you to look at.
Okay.
May I show these to her? These are 634 through 709. Off-the-record discussion held at council table.
You can give her the documents, but you have to come back to the stand to question her. If you need to stand there for identification of a particular exhibit or something, that's all right.
Do you recognize this item? It's 634.
Yes.
How do you recognize it?
It's my handwriting saying it's 317B, and you can also see my handwriting on the bottom corner piece of the paper, saying 317B.
And you took this picture?
Yes.
Exhibit 635?
Yes. It's 317D, with my handwriting also on the piece of paper.
Okay. Exhibit 636?
317E, it's the same thing on the paper.
Exhibit 637?
317G, and my handwriting would be on the back side of the magazine.
632, a yellow sticky?
Yes, there's a yellow sticky right next to it.
638?
317H, and I see my handwriting on the bottom corner of the piece of paper.
Okay. Exhibit 639?
317I, and it's another loose leaf paper.
Did you take this photograph as well?
Yes. 317J, and it's another piece of paper I photographed.
It's Exhibit 640?
Yes.
Exhibit 641?
317K, and it's a magazine that I photographed.
Exhibit 642?
317O, and it's the same.
You photographed this as well?
I photographed it. 317M, and I photographed that.
Okay. That's Exhibit 643?
Yes.
Exhibit 644.
Your Honor, I have two objections. 1. Counsel is down there and it's hard to hear him. And secondly, I think this is cumulative.
The exhibits are in evidence. Is there some?
There will be in a moment.
317O.
Would you like me to examine her from down there?
Well, except on specific exhibits where you need to approach. I don't.
I just want to run down through the list so we can move to the next part, Your Honor.
Okay.
Your Honor, I don't want to make a speaking objection, but I think I understand the next part. And I don't understand going through every one of these pieces of paper for the next part, which involves 19 pieces of paper.
Your objection is overruled.
Okay.
But I would rather have you question from here. The main reason is that the audience has a hard time hearing, and we've tried to have everyone speak where there's a microphone.
If you could, please, just read the exhibit number and then the item on the photograph, and let us know whether or not you're the one that took that picture.
Okay.
What's the next one in order?
Exhibit 644, and I photographed 317-0. 654, and I photographed 317p. 646, 317q. Exhibit 647, and I photographed 317r. 648, and I photographed 317s. 649, and its exhibit, or item number 317t. 650, and its 317u. 651, 317b. 652, 317w. 653, 317x. And this is exhibit 654. I'm unsure what this photograph is as far as what number it was.
May have I see the front of that, please?
Indicating.
Okay.
655, 317z. 656, 317, 657, and I'm unsure of what number it was in 317, but I recognize it. 658, 317, d. 659, 317, f. 660, 317, h.
Your Honor, I'm sorry. I'm going to make a slightly different objection. I think the witness is just reading from the exhibits, and they speak for themselves.
She's saying that she took those photographs. That's what I understood.
Yes. Yeah.
When she's saying, I took this photograph, she's just giving you a list. So overruled.
All right.
Okay. 661, 317, e. 662, 317, j. 663, 317, k. 664, 317, l. 665, 317, m. 666, 317, u. 667, 317, p. 668, 317, q. 669, 317, r. 670, 317, s. 671, 317, t. 672, 317, u. 673, 317, v. 674, 317, w. 675, 317, x. 676, 317, y. 677, 317, z. 678, 317, AAA. 679, 317, b. 680, 317, c. 681, 617, f. And then we moved on to a new item number that another bag I opened up, and this is.
Let me stop you right there.
Okay.
That's as far as I wanted you to go for now.
Okay.
That long list of exhibits, which item did they come from?
They came from 317.
And do you recognize this item, which is marked as Exhibit 470?
Yes.
And can you tell us about that, please?
This is item number 317, and the way I can recognize it is it has my initials on the evidence tape that I sealed it up with after I examined it. When I first got it, it had evidence tape on it. I broke the evidence tape, opened it up, separated all the items. And when I was finished with it, I placed the items that I did not separate out from this, put my evidence seal back on and signed it.
Okay. You mentioned something about separating items out of 317. Would you like me to get that out of the way?
That's fine there. Yes.
Could you explain that for us, please?
I was asked to do a visual inspection of the contents, and I used an alternate light source which goes into the UV wavelengths. And when you search for body fluids, they will fluoresce under UV light, and anything that seemed to fluoresce, it could be body fluids, but it could also be other things. My job was to find items that weren't on the paper when they were published, they were placed there later. It could be anything that fluoresced. And I separated those items out for further testing. And when I did that, I repackaged them into another bag and I sent them to the Department of Justice lab to find out what those fluids or deposits were.
How did you mark on a specific item where you suspected there may be some kind of body fluid or other substance that was foreign to that magazine or picture?
I sent the entire item to be re-inspected by the Department of Justice. I also put a yellow tab, a post-it note, on the page that I suspected, but I also requested that the Department of Justice re-evaluate the entire magazine or piece of paper.
Okay. And did you keep a log of the items that you separated out of the briefcase?
Yes. I made a separate property form when I separated items out.
Would you please tell the jury which items you sent to the DOJ and removed from the briefcase?
Okay. I separated out 317B, 317G, 317K, 317L, 317R, 317S, 317Y, 317B, 317C, 317E, 317K, 317R, 317U, 317Y, 317B.
Okay. The first item, was that 317B, as in boy?
Yes.
How did you package those items to go to the Department of Justice?
I repackaged them in a separate evidence bag.
Were any of those items in an evidence bag aside from inside the briefcase?
I got them out of the briefcase, separated them and placed them into another bag.
So while they were in the briefcase, they weren't in a bag?
No.
Okay. I'd like to show you exhibit number 529, please, and I'd ask you to open up that plastic bag and take the contents out. Do you recognize that item?
Yes.
What is that?
This is the evidence bag I placed the separated items into. I recognize it, because it's my handwriting, and it should be my handwriting on the seal on the top.
Okay. On the front of that bag, did you itemize the items that you had removed from the original 317 and placed into that bag?
Yes. They are listed on the contents.
Are you the first person to use that bag to package evidence from 317?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall which date you sent it to the Department of Justice?
On my report I specify it as the 5th of February 04.
Do you have a signed receipt?
Yes.
And what is indicated on the receipt?
The 4th of February 04.
Calls for hearsay.
The 4th of February 04.
Just, overruled. Next question.
And how did you deliver the item to the Department of Justice?
I delivered it by hand. It came directly from our secure lab to their secure lab.
And to whom did you hand the item?
Char Marie, who is a criminalist at the Department of Justice.
All right, let's take our morning break.
May we have just a minute, Mr. Sanger and I? Discussion held off the record at sidebar.